and welcome to our GLE celebrating or marking World Day Against the Death Penalty. Before we begin, I want to start with some acknowledgments. First of all, today in the United States is Indigenous Peoples Day, and we are here physically in person in Minneapolis, which is the ancestral and traditional territory of the Dakota people. And I spent some time in Australia recently, and I really like the way they do their acknowledgments. So to echo that, I'll add that we acknowledge the Dakota people as the traditional custodians of this land on which we meet, and we pay our respect to Dakota elders, past, present, and future. I also want to acknowledge and thank Frederickson and Byron for hosting this event, both in person and virtually, and we're really grateful for their support, not only for this event, but they do a lot of support for our death penalty work as well. My name is Amy Birkis. I am a senior staff attorney at the Advocates for Human Rights. And when people ask what I actually do as a senior staff attorney with the International Justice Program, I describe my job as a megaphone. I'm that megaphone with our partners around the world, including our partners that are trying to abolish the death penalty, so that their voices can be amplified to try to press their governments to abolish the death penalty. And you'll hear a little bit today about how we function as that megaphone to try to accomplish abolition of the death penalty. Joining us will be my colleagues Jennifer Pressolder and Elizabeth Lacey in just a minute. I just wanted to give a brief overview of what we're hoping to cover in today's presentation. Forgive me a second as there we go. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview about World Day Against the Death Penalty, and in particular this year's theme. Then Jennifer will present an overview of our UN advocacy, and Elizabeth will talk about our advocacy strategies, and then I'll tackle the question, does it work? Does advocacy at the United Nations help press countries to abolish the death penalty? And then we'll talk about how you might want to get involved with our efforts and our efforts with our colleagues. This is a continuing legal education presentation, and we've been approved for 1 hour of standard credit. The code is 473328, and I'll try to remember to say that again later on, but it's 473328, but you can also just search online for the Advocates for Human Rights. And October 10th, which is a memorable date at least for those of us who are in favor of abolishing the death penalty, because it's always World Day Against the Death Penalty. The theme for World Day Against the Death Penalty this year is the death penalty and torture, and the slogan that we came up with at the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty is the death penalty, a road paved with torture. I should say that the Advocates for Human Rights serves on the steering committee of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, and I'm one of the vice presidents of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. I also chair the working group on World Day Against the Death Penalty. So we've been working on this World Day all year. And this, you can see in the background the image that goes along with the World Day theme. And this is actually the 20th year that we have marked World Day Against the Death Penalty. And every year, more countries abolish the death penalty, which is really encouraging. But it also gives us sort of a focus. And worldwide today, there are hundreds and hundreds of events marking World Day Against the Death Penalty. If you go on social media and search hashtag no death penalty, you'll see all sorts of governments chiming in, different events around the world, and you can add to that movement as well by following that hashtag no death penalty and add your comments. You can mention that you were attending a presentation about World Day Against the Death Penalty and be part of the conversation. I'll talk just briefly about this year's World Day theme, and then we'll go into sort of the nuts and bolts of our advocacy, which is specific to this year's World Day theme. But on the theme of torture and the death penalty, historically, torture has been used intentionally as part of the execution process. If you think about the historical means by which people were executed, crucifixion, for example, nailing somebody up onto a tree or other device and letting them, in anguish. That was the purpose was not only to kill them, but to ensure that they were tortured in the process. But other forms of execution historically, drowning, beating someone to death, burning someone at the stake, it is part and parcel of the execution, had been historically killing someone, it had been torturing them in the process, drawing and quartering someone. In the Roman Empire, I was reading up, and apparently a method of execution in the Roman Empire was stuffing someone in a sack with a number of animals and then throwing them into a body of water. Boiling somebody to death in the English system, one method of execution was crushing them by weights, like slowly adding more and more weight until their body collapsed under those weights. And another, famous execution was death by hemlock. Socrates was executed for his advocacy with the youth, and hemlock can cause foaming at the mouth, confusion, seizures, and paralysis, including paralysis of your respiratory muscles. So you can't take a breath, and so you're basically suffocating to death, which harkens to the methods of execution that we have here in the United States, which are supposedly designed not to torture someone, but in fact, that paralysis is an intentional part of the procedure. And so torture has always been part and parcel of the death penalty. But even though most countries, and I say most countries nowadays don't intentionally torture someone as a process of the execution, nonetheless, our international human rights standards have a very interesting definition of torture as it touches on the death penalty. So this is from the Convention Against Torture, Article 1, Paragraph 1, and you'll see how it defines what torture is, but it specifically excludes, in the last sentence, it does not include pain or suffering arising only from, inherent in, or incidental to lawful sanction. And so governments will say, well, this is a lawful sanction. We have said in our statutes that this is how we execute someone, and so it's sort of their escape clause to say you can't talk about our execution methods as a form of torture because of this language. And of course, when this language was drafted, it wasn't sort of top of mind thinking about methods of execution. But fortunately, as with all sorts of international human rights standards, they evolve. And so we develop a better understanding of what our human rights are. And this is a longer quote from the Human Rights Committee. They drafted a few years back a general comment on the right to life, as it's articulated in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or ICCPR. And the Human Rights Committee experts said that, when they were writing, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights talks about torture, as does the Convention Against Torture, but also talks about cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment. So it's CID is what the common abbreviation is. And the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights also prohibits torture and CID, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And as the experts said, that when they drafted it, the state parties didn't universally think that the death penalty was cruel, inhuman, or degrading per se. But as the examination of that language and practices evolved, there's this ultimate view that, and Article 7 is where we have this definition of cruel and inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment, may ultimately lead to the conclusion that the death penalty is contrary to Article 7 under all circumstances. And considerable progress has been made toward establishing an agreement among all the state parties to the ICCPR to consider the death penalty per se as cruel, inhuman, or degrading form of punishment. So things are moving, but we're not quite where we want to be. And this year's World Day is a chance to have this conversation about torture and the death penalty, and to ultimately, I think, we'll recognize that the death penalty always is a form of torture, or at a minimum, cruel, inhuman, or degrading punishment. So that's just a little bit of a taste of this year's World Day theme. But now we're going to jump into talk about our advocacy. And I'm going to hand off to my colleague Jennifer to cover that. And then Elizabeth will take the floor.
All right, thanks a lot, Amy. So as you saw, the World Day Against the Death Penalty is, there's a different theme every year, and we did a great job of talking about the theme this year. We're going to shift a little bit because we wanted to talk about what we see really as a bright spot in the world of human rights right now, which is the death penalty is being abolished in a number of different countries. And we have, through our work in international advocacy, and working with partners that are working to abolish the death penalty in their countries, we've been able to see that firsthand. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of how we do our UN advocacy, and Elizabeth's going to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the strategies that we use. And then Amy will talk more specifically about using UN advocacy to abolish the death penalty. So the Advocates for Human Rights, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is an international non-governmental organization that's based here in Minneapolis. We do work in the state of Minnesota as well as internationally. And we use international advocacy at the United Nations and at the regional human rights mechanisms to advance our mission to implement international human rights standards and promote civil society and reinforce the rule of law. The Advocates has something that's called special consultative status at the United Nations, and what that means is that we have been approved. There's about, I think there's over 1,000 NGOs or non-governmental organizations that have this consultative status. And what that allows us to do is participate in the human rights mechanisms at the United Nations. And so there's space for us to make oral interventions at different human rights bodies and to get a grounds pass to be able to participate in things in person. So this is a photo from the United Nations office in Geneva, which is where the human rights and humanitarian mechanisms of the UN are, so not in New York. But I think one thing that's really important to understand is about, in the sort of the bigger picture, is that the international human rights law framework is hugely useful in identifying where there are gaps in human rights protections at the local level, and it's also really helpful to engage with the different UN bodies in order to use the UN system and this international community to put pressure from the outside on the governments. And the partners that we're working with, the civil society organizations, are working in their own countries on the issues there. And so then they're able to put pressure from underneath. So we sort of talk about it as a pressure cooker kind of thing, but using these things together can help to make change in the individual countries, so changes to laws and things like abolishing the death penalty. The Advocates for Human Rights was actually just in Geneva. We had a team there in September, and we've this is the first time we've been back to Geneva since 2019. Actually, we had planned to be there in March of 2020 and had to cancel that trip and haven't been back. But because our partners have found that this international advocacy is such an effective tool in order to push their governments to change the laws and to abolish the death penalty, we were able to go back with human rights defenders from a number of different countries. So we have a couple of representatives from the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty that are in this photo, as well as human rights defenders from the Philippines, from Indonesia, from Pakistan, and from Ghana. And part of what we're doing with these partners is capacity building and training with them. So here's a photo from the training that we did on Sunday before we went into the Human Rights Council room and started working on our advocacy on Monday and throughout the week. But our role is also to support their advocacy. So it's sort of like not only provide training like in this photo, but also the on-the-job training, the side-by-side training, working with them on that. A lot of our advocacy happens at the Human Rights Council, which is what is called a charter-based mechanism at the United Nations. It's a body that draws its authority from the UN Charter. And so what that means is that every member of the United Nations has a seat in the room. So you can sort of see in the bigger photo there, it's alphabetical, although it's in French, which is always a challenge for us to get the seating chart so we can figure out where folks are sitting. But even though there are 47 Human Rights Council members, and you might remember during the Trump administration when the U.S. stepped away from withdrew from the Human Rights Council, in fact, it doesn't matter that much if you're on the Human Rights Council, because every country in the room has the right to speak up and to both criticize and to compliment, and also to make recommendations to other bodies that are in the room. So this is the political human rights body at the United Nations, and it also is a body that has something that's called a Universal Periodic Review mechanism. And so this is the human rights mechanism that is sort of the broadest, because it can review all human rights not with the treaty bodies, they're reviewing rights that are, within a specific international human rights treaty. But the Universal Periodic Review process involves every right and every UN member state. So there are some countries, we do a lot of work in India. India does not have a good ratification record with human rights treaties, but they still have to be reviewed in the Universal Periodic Review process. So that means that approximately every 5 years, every UN member state has to come before the Human Rights Council body. It's basically a peer review kind of process. So it's a state-driven process. The members of the human rights, or the delegates to the Human Rights Council, are representatives of their governments, of their members of the Foreign Service, and so they're diplomats that are making recommendations to the countries. And then the country that is going through this interactive dialogue process, which is the name for the sort of the in-person review process, they can either accept or note, which is a diplomatic way of saying reject those recommendations from their peers. So this is an infographic that you'll see a couple of times as Amy talks in more specifics about it, but just very generally so that you understand the Universal Periodic Review, or UPR, reporting cycle. There are sort of 4 different phases, and one is the preparation of information for review, and there are a number of different stakeholders that have the ability to provide information about the human rights record in that country. And so organizations like the Advocates for Human Rights, we submit what's called Stakeholder Reports, often joint stakeholder reports with our partner organizations. But national human rights institutions also submit information, as well as various UN agencies that might be operating in the country. And then the government itself also submits a written. So all of this is a written process, a written report. The second phase is the interactive dialogue, which I was referring to before, and that involves a 3-hour session in which the government of that country is presenting what usually they present as a very positive human rights review or record, because they want to look good in front of all the other peers, countries in the world. And the ultimate outcome is a draft list of recommendations, which then in the third phase, which is called the adoption of the report, involves the government publicly stating which recommendations they adopt and which they note. And then the fourth stage is implementation, and so that is the government is supposed to be implementing those recommendations that they accepted. And so there are roles for non-governmental organizations like the Advocates and our partners in each of these phases, but especially important is probably in the implementation of the recommendations. So our partners then, once they have recommendations, will go back to the countries and then continue to lobby there, meet with different agencies and say, your government promised to do this, that, or the other. And with that, I'm going to stop and let Elizabeth talk a little bit more specifically about the sort of the mechanics of and the strategies behind this advocacy.
Jennifer. So as we've mentioned, we are a megaphone for our partners. So we do a lot of these advocacy strategies alongside them. And we have done a lot of this advocacy in the virtual setting over the past 3 years, but we also recently were able to do that in person again. And so there's sort of different ways, a few different ways that we can intervene at the UN. So, that's a picture. So here's just a picture of our team in Geneva. We are in what's called the Serpentine Lounge, which is where NGOs or non-governmental organizations generally gather. It's 2 levels below the Human Rights Council sessions. We can go up and down and speak with the diplomats as we're going. And I think we're just kind of relaxing and discussing things right now in this photo, but you can see there's a lot of representatives of our partners there. So one of the things that Amy and Jennifer already talked about is stakeholder reports. And this is at that first stage of the UPR, which happens 6 months prior to the interactive dialogue, where the states receive their actual recommendations. So this is our chance to give information to the states that are going to be giving recommendations. It's our chance to give them more information than the government itself is going to give them. Because the government is going to give them a national report, but of course, as Jennifer mentioned, they're going to be very positive. With respect to the death penalty, they might say, well, we have a moratorium on execution, so we're done, we don't need to do anything else. And we will suggest, no, actually, we would love if you would abolish the death penalty in the law. And so we both state facts that might fill in those sort of gaps, and then also provide priority recommendations that we would like states to make to the country that's under review. And that's a really important thing to start with, because that kind of opens an avenue for a lot of different other types of advocacy to do. And I will say that stakeholder report also is compiled with all of the other NGO stakeholder reports by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, by their staff. They compile it into a summary, and that is then given to all of the member states who will then be giving recommendations. So then, as you can see here, we have a little meeting between a delegate and one of our partners. This is from a past Geneva trip, but they're using one-pagers. I don't know if you can see that very clearly, but it's a front and back piece of an advocacy tool that we use. And it basically is a summary of the stakeholder reports, and it includes the priority recommendations just really laid out for them to see, because delegates are very busy and they don't want to read necessarily the entire stakeholder report. So we compile those one-pagers. And then we also compile countries to target. So we don't just walk up to any country and say, hey, can you make a recommendation to abolish the death penalty? Because not every country is going to prioritize that issue. So the way that we target countries is by looking at the past UPRs. So this is a process that happens every 5 years. So the last time there was a UPR, we'll see, okay, did this country make a recommendation to the country that's under review? And if they did, we're going to target them and ask them to do it again. And we're going to thank them for that recommendation as well. That's when our electronic lobbying comes in. So this involves sending many, many emails. As I and my colleagues know, often it can entail sending over 150 emails, depending on sort of the list of countries to target. And so that electronic lobbying involves, as I mentioned, thanking the states for their recommendation at the last UPR, and then also asking them to make another recommendation that we suggest about that country. But it also often includes a request to attend our site event, which I'll talk about in a minute, or a request to meet individually with us and with our partners. And that's a great opportunity to have that face-to-face time and really talk about the issues that are most important and the recommendations that would be most important to us and to our partners. So that's kind of where the in-person lobbying comes in. There are two parts to that. So one is actually setting up meetings with delegates. And so if you recall, there was a picture of the Human Rights Council room with all of the names of the countries. So they're all in one place, and we see who they are. So we can go up to them, tap them on the shoulder, and say, hi, would you be interested in meeting with us? We're here for this week. So then once we've established those meetings, we can sit down with them and talk about what their priorities might be, what we would like them to recommend in the next CPR, and any other facts and figures that we want to share with them in the moment. We'll give them our one-pager as well. And it's a really great opportunity for us to learn more about our future advocacy, what that country might have as their priorities, but also to just have that actual face-to-face with the delegates. So we also ask for virtual meetings now because when we were in Geneva, we didn't have a lot of time to meet with everybody. And so we have done a few virtual meetings, one with Timor-Leste. We have another one with Switzerland tomorrow. And that's pretty much the same thing, just over Zoom or over another platform, but another opportunity to share information with the delegates. And then I think we've got a picture here of a few meetings going on at one time in the Serpentine Lounge. So you can see, I think that's me right there in the orange, in a group we're speaking to Montenegro. And then over, I think you can see our colleague Nathan talking to the Marshall Islands. So we had people rotating in and out of those meetings to have give their piece and speak to the delegates about their priority recommendations. The final advocacy opportunity I'll talk about is side events. And this was our side event that we held on Thursday of the week we were in Geneva. And this is just, again, another opportunity to share information with the delegates, to have them as a captive audience for about an hour. We invited as many people as we could to this event, and we have done these in a virtual setting as well, and have been able to record them and send them directly to the delegates to watch on demand, which I think is a really great way to give them the chance to actually watch it on their own time. But you can see our panel included all of our partners from Pakistan, Indonesia, from Ghana, and from the Philippines. They all provided information about the death penalty in their countries and the priority recommendations they'd like to be made. So I think that's all of our advocacy, and I'll pass it to Amy.
So we do all this work, sending hundreds of emails and trying to set up lots of meetings, and of course doing the reports, working with our partner organizations to get all this information together. And of course, it's important to take a step back and say, is it worthwhile? Because if it's not worthwhile, we should be focusing our energy and efforts elsewhere. So we're going to take a little look to see whether this type of advocacy is effective. And this is a really good time to do it. And we're, in fact, at the Advocates for Human Rights, we're doing a deeper dive into this starting right now. I'm going to be presenting at a symposium in February. So this is sort of preliminary, just a taste of this deeper research that we're doing right now at the Advocates for Human Rights, to look at whether, in particular, this type of advocacy at the Universal Periodic Review is not only our advocacy, but is the Universal Periodic Review itself an effective mechanism to encourage governments to abolish the death penalty. So we can't say our advocacy specifically changed this and made this country abolish the death penalty. I don't think anyone can really, stake that claim. But we want to know, is this particular tool at the UN something that's worthwhile? And so first, I want to talk about Sierra Leone. We have a really good partner organization that's a member of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty that's based in Sierra Leone. And we worked with them to do a stakeholder report, like Elizabeth mentioned. And this was during the pandemic, so we weren't able to go to Geneva, but we did electronic lobbying, sent one-pagers via email. We had a virtual side event. We did a lot of engagements for Sierra Leone and several other countries that were being reviewed at the time. And Sierra Leone is one of our opportunities to celebrate, because last year, Sierra Leone abolished the death penalty. So we want to see, is there anything, what would we look to see whether there's a connection? How could we tell whether there's a connection between the UPR and Sierra Leone's decision to abolish the death penalty? So, what do you think, how could we, Jennifer described that 5-year cycle. What signs would we look for to say, oh, there might be actually a connection here between the UPR and a country's decision to abolish the death penalty? What would you expect to see if there is a connection? Veronica, you're looking very expressive. What would you expect to see if there's a connection between this 5-year cycle and a country's decision to abolish the death penalty? What types of evidence would you look for?
A recommendation by a state.
Yeah, you'd look for recommendations, like our country's recommending that the country abolish the death penalty. Sure. What else would you look for to see if there might be a connection between this UPR mechanism that Jennifer described and a country's decision to abolish the death penalty?
Accepting a recommendation.
That they'd accept the recommendation, because that's part of the procedure. As Jennifer said, they have the choice when they receive a recommendation, they can accept it or they can note it. So do they accept the recommendation? That might show that there's a connection. Okay, they had the death penalty, there were recommendations to abolish, they accepted, and then they abolished, right? So there might be some connection there. Anything else we would look at as part of this procedure?
I would look at the public discussions in that country and in the government.
Yeah, what did they say at the time? What did they say when they went to Geneva? Did they make any representations? Make any promises? How did they talk about the death penalty when they went to Geneva? And how were they talking about it back home as well? Sure. Anything else that you would look for in terms of evidence that there's some connection here between the UPR and abolition of the death penalty? Veronica? No? Oh, you're...
I mean, ultimately, whether or not they change their laws.
Yeah, like, ultimately, yeah, did they abolish? Did they move toward abolition? And I think also we look at the timing. Like, when do things happen? Like, are things happening, like, a roundabout or just, like, randomly over the course of that 5-year cycle? Or can we see some connection, like, just looking at the circumstantial evidence about when things happen? Does it seem like there's a connection? So for Sierra Leone, I want to, like, sort of dig a little deeper, because I think we're going to take a look at 3 different case studies, and each one is a little bit different. But I think Sierra Leone is probably the easiest case study to dig into. So Sierra Leone, in its national report, and remember that's the first part of the cycle that Jennifer talked about, that was in February of last year. In that national report, Sierra Leone acknowledged that in the last cycle, in other words, in 2016, Sierra Leone had received several recommendations to abolish the death penalty, but Sierra Leone had not done so. They didn't accept those recommendations, and in fact, they received 14 recommendations in the previous cycle to abolish the death penalty, and they decided they're not going to do it. But in the meantime, this is another thing they talk about in their report, there had been a constitutional review committee that Sierra Leone had. A lot of countries will have this, like, look at the Constitution, are there things we need to change to improve it, et cetera. And that Constitutional Review Committee made recommendations in November of 2017, so after the last UPR, and one of the set of recommendations was to abolish the death penalty. So here we are in 2021, and the government of Sierra Leone has been sitting on this recommendation from the Constitutional Review Committee since 2017. It's been out there, and they haven't done anything. So they talk about this in their national report, and they say that on December 17th, 2020, this is like just a couple months before the national report is submitted to the United Nations, the president stated that the clear intention of his government to abolish the death penalty. So the president has put himself on the record in December, going into the year that the UPR is happening, that they're committed to abolish the death penalty. So that's the national report. Then we fast forward to May of 2021, May of last year, and that's when the interactive dialogue happened. So the summary of the interactive dialogue, I won't go and play the actual clip, but you can go back and watch that if you're a UN Web TV junkie. On the topic of the death penalty, the delegation that Sierra Leone sent to the UN, to Geneva, said that the cabinet had approved the abolition of the death penalty. The deputy minister of justice had already briefed the leader of government in business the leader of government business in Parliament, the opposition leader in Parliament, the British High Commission, and the United Nations in Sierra Leone on this. So they're doing a lot of, like, letting people know, it's kind of things are snowballing here. We're letting people know that, and they also said in the interactive dialogue that the number of people on death row had not increased, and the drafted amendments to a particular law were awaiting submission to Parliament for enactment. So this is where things are in May. And when these UPRs happen, just to give you a little behind the scenes, what we do at the Advocates, we don't go to Geneva for the actual UPR because we don't have any, at that point, it's too late to influence the process, but we get up very early and watch on UN Web TV live. And we have these tally sheets. So on these tally sheets, I'm listening to the 3 hours as it goes on, and I'm live tweeting, and I'm keeping track on who's making recommendations on the death penalty. So remember, it was 14 in 2016. 26 countries made recommendations this time around. And that's thanks to my colleagues sending all those emails out, I think, really raising the attention about and awareness about the issue, because we didn't engage on Sierra Leone last time around. So there's a lot more attention to the death penalty issues going from 14 to 26. And that was really exciting to see, but we still can't say, oh, that caused this change, because the government had already been on the record, had already sort of stated really positively that they intended to abolish the death penalty. Nonetheless, it was really good to see there's a lot of encouragement, right? And so if the government's already heading in one direction, and there are these nudges to keep it going, that can also, at least the theory would be, that can also help get the deed done, get them to actually take action. So the next thing in the process is when the government of Sierra Leone responds to those recommendations, including those 26 recommendations to abolish the death penalty. And on July 21st of last year, the government submitted its response and accepted all the recommendations on the death penalty. It said, yes, we're going to abolish the death penalty. Yes, we're going to ratify the second optional protocol to the ICCPR, which is a treaty about abolishing the death penalty. So it puts them on the record. That's July 21st. I forgot I have a slide that shows this. Oh, there we go. July 23rd, 2 days later, Parliament votes to abolish the death penalty. So Circumstantial evidence, I know, but there might be some connection between putting those commitments out there to the UN and then Parliament taking action to abolish the death penalty. And remember, they had been sitting on those recommendations since 2017 to abolish the death penalty from the Constitutional Review Committee. So you would think, well, good and done. Like the president has said, he's committed to abolishing and all of that. Some time passes, and then on October 2nd, that's when the final step in the process that Jennifer described before implementation is adoption of the UPR outcomes, right? So that's that form, it's like a 30-minute thing at the UN, and they just kind of wrap everything up in the bow. This is the review that's happened. This is what happened to the recommendations. This is how Sierra Leone responded, and so on and so forth. It's not until October 8th that the president signs the bill into law. So it's a pretty big gap between the July 23rd and October 8th. Any guesses why there was such a big gap? Why didn't the president sign it into law right away in July? Why didn't the president sign it into law before the adoption of UPR outcomes? Any thoughts about why the president would wait until October 8th of last year to do that?
Was it to have it signed before the World Day Against the Death Penalty?
That's my theory. Last year, that World Day Against the Death Penalty was on October. Was on October 10th. It was on a Sunday. And so October 8th is the last business day before World Day Against the Death Penalty. And my theory is he wanted to do it as part of World Day Against the Death Penalty. So he was sort of sitting on it and wanted to have this make a big deal about it, which it shows a signal that he is wanting to sort of resonate with the international community about this, that he wants it to be a big deal. He wants it to be something that can be celebrated worldwide, and that might explain a little bit of the timing about why he waited until then to sign it into law. That's just a theory, but it would be interesting to see, when our research will go into a little bit more depth here and see what, whether he made any statements to that effect. But looking back at the timeline, Jennifer said there were two different action points. The first one was Parliament passing the law, and the second was the president, signing the law into effect. And so they're happening like right in the midst of the UPR, really close timing between these different events that, I think that might be some evidence, albeit circumstantial, that there's some connection there between what's going on in Sierra Leone, their decision to abolish the death penalty, and what's going on with the UPR. There seems to be some kind of a connection there. At least that's, I think there's some evidence there that you might say, yeah, there's a connection. So we'll be looking at this in more detail, but that's just one case study. And the good news is, whether there's a connection or not, Sierra Leone has now abolished the death penalty. And another thing that's really exciting to see this, and this sort of confirms to me my theory that Sierra Leone really cared about the UPR and wanted to have this win coming out of it, is they abolished in October of last year. Starting in November, there was a new set of countries going through the UPR, and Sierra Leone started making recommendations to other countries that they abolish the death penalty. So that, to me, says Sierra Leone has big buy-in into the UPR process and wants to see itself as a leader in abolishing the death penalty, and wants to, once they've done it, they want others to do it as well. So I think that's a really promising example. Let's take a look at another example that's a little bit more complicated. So,
can I ask you a question first about that, Leone? So did they then change all the people who were on death row? Did their sentences, were they commuted to?
I would have to go back and check. I'm not sure, but I will let you know. I will check and let you know. So Papua New Guinea is a different case study, but gives us a little bit more information about sort of our theories here. In its national report, I guess just to look at the overall timing, where we saw Papua New Guinea take action toward abolition was between the interactive dialogue and the adoption of the report. So Papua New Guinea's conduct in the UPR couldn't be more different from Sierra Leone. So in its national report, and remember that's at the first part of the stage, the country said Papua New Guinea maintains its prerogative to maintain the death penalty as a punishment for serious crimes. It's like, we have the right to do it, we're doing it, which a lot of governments do. That's nothing novel. And then at the interactive dialogue stage, which happened in November of last year, that was right when Sierra Leone started doing its advocacy to other countries, but on the death penalty, Papua New Guinea had legislation in place. However, it had not been implemented for various reasons, including cultural and religious beliefs. So they had some legislation in place, not really clear what exactly. And then on the abolition of the death penalty, the delegation mentioned the de facto moratorium in Papua New Guinea, since 1954. They haven't executed anyone since 1954. While referring to the criminal justice system of sovereign states and the importance of the right to life. So they're making sort of vague statements that are, if you talk about state sovereignty and all of that, oftentimes that's countries defending their use of the death penalty. So no big promises made, no big assurances, and we nonetheless we did our tally sheet again, and they went from, in 2016, 13 countries made recommendations, and in 2021, 20 countries made recommendations. So again, we had, thanks to our advocacy, I think, in part, we had a big uptick in the number of countries making recommendations, and that was really promising. I just want to check to see whether Sierra Leone was one of them, but I'm not sure. Not for Papua New Guinea. So that's the interactive dialogue that happens in November, and then in January, Parliament abolishes the death penalty. So doesn't seem consistent with the representations during the interactive dialogue. It doesn't seem consistent with the national report. So we're not quite sure what's going on there. Interestingly, on March 22nd, so right before the adoption of the UPR outcomes, that's when Papua New Guinea responds to all the recommendations. So you might think, well, they abolished the death penalty, so they should be then accepting those recommendations that they've already done, right? Nope. They noted all of them. So it doesn't really make sense to me after they had already revised their criminal code to eliminate the death penalty. Why would they not accept those recommendations that told them to do what they've already done? But in fact, what they said in their addendum, where they're formally responding to these recommendations just days before it all gets wrapped up in a bow, it just says on January 22nd, 2022, the Criminal Code Act was amended to abolish the death penalty. But they noted all the recommendations. So it's not clear to me that there was any connection at all, although they did acknowledge the abolition of the death penalty. It seems like this is sort of the anti-Sierra Leone example. Like, they still abolished, but it's not quite, maybe ships passing in the night. Teresa?
Did it have anything to do with who was making the recommendations, like which government was making the recommendations to Papua New Guinea?
Yeah, sometimes it does, but they lump them all together. So they didn't say, oh, we'll do this one and not this one. And if we look at the countries that made recommendations on the death penalty, Portugal, Spain, Switzerland, Timor-Leste, which is in the region. That's why Elizabeth is having the virtual meeting with them. They're a great supporter of our efforts. Ukraine, Uruguay, Australia, Chile, Cyprus, Fiji, another country in the region, and has been a really great advocate since Fiji abolished the death penalty. Finland, France, Germany, Haiti, Iceland, Latvia, Marshall Islands, again, another country we target with our advocacy, Mexico, Nepal, and New Zealand. So it doesn't seem like there's any particular rhyme or reason to say, oh, it's because of the political tensions between PNG and these other countries. And, Australia obviously has a lot of influence in the region as well. They're a huge supporter of our efforts to abolish the death penalty. So not clear whether it's the messenger or just something else. I don't know.
Has Papua New Guinea ever accepted recommendations before, or have they always just noted them and then claimed independence in how they developed recommendations?
So when they submitted, they certainly didn't note all of them, which they can. And that's part of the UPR. Like, they're free to say no to everything. It's a choice. They opt in if they want to. And so they did accept other recommendations, but just on the death penalty, no.
Okay.
So I don't have an explanation. This is why it's interesting, right? So
my theory is not working either.
Yeah. So this is fun stuff that lawyers get to do when we work in the human rights field. So that's Papua New Guinea. And then we'll talk a little bit about Chad, which is maybe a little bit in the middle here. Chad, with its national report, and where it took action is after the adoption of the report, like a year after the adoption of the report. So again, we're thinking, it happened so far away, maybe there's not really a connection because of the timing. It doesn't seem like it's related. Oh, no. So in Chad's national report, which happened in August 2018, Chad said, and Chad was a really interesting situation because they had abolished the death penalty and then they reinstated it for terrorism because they had been having a lot of Boko Haram attacks in Chad. And so it was really, Chad was struggling with these terrorist attacks and had sort of jumped back into the death penalty for terrorism. So in the national report, the government said that legislation has been adopted about, the death penalty can't be imposed for ordinary offenses, The government is keen to combat terrorism while respecting human rights, for example, by dropping the use of the death penalty, also in cases of terrorism. So this is the government saying, we want to get rid of the death penalty for terrorism-related offenses, and then said specifically, the government is in support of abolishing the death penalty completely. That was in the National Report in August 2018. At the Interactive Dialogue in November 2018, the Minister of Justice took the floor and said that, and this, I think, is really important in terms of to see how the UPR influences things. The Minister of Justice stated that support from the country's partners was needed in order to abolish the death penalty, given that the maintenance of serious criminals and terrorists required out-of-the-way maximum security detention centers and careful management. In other words, like, if they have terrorist suspects and people who've been convicted of terrorism, they need to have really secure ways to contain them and not need to execute them. And so we need help, basically, is what Chab's position was. With respect to there had been a death sentence handed down in August of 2018, and so let's look at the timeline here. So just months before the Interactive Dialogue, they had sentenced another person to death, and that, of course, made some governments upset. So with respect to that death sentence, the Minister of Justice said it was difficult for him to comment on a judicial decision, but there was sufficient evidence that was compelling that this person had engaged in terrorism, and noted that they were revising this Terrorism Act with the support of partners from the European Union and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and a new law would bring the definition of terrorism into line with international standards, and would be implemented with strict respect for the rights of all persons to a fair trial. And then in the concluding remarks, the minister singled out the attention that had been given to the death penalty in the Interactive Dialogue. He took note of all recommendations concerning the 3 main points: the death penalty, gender equality, and freedom of thought expression in the press. So he knew he was getting a lot of heat on the death penalty, especially because they started sentencing people to death again. So there was evidently some pressure during that Interactive Dialogue. Now, the report of the working group that was published in December 2018, Chad could have waited until March of 2019 to respond to the recommendations, but instead it responded like within about a month, and it accepted all of the death penalty recommendations to abolish the death penalty, ratify the second optional protocol. It accepted them right away, like did not delay. And so you can see, like, this is the government committing. Maybe the government is like taking, going out ahead of what Parliament will want to do. They're putting that commitment out there quickly. And then the adoption of the UPR outcomes happens in March. They didn't abolish the death penalty until April of 2020. So a pretty big gap, a year-long gap after the adoption of the outcomes and the actual abolition of the death penalty. Nonetheless, I think you can say you have all these assurances on the part of the government that the government wants to do it, is committing to do it, and maybe it's just a matter of timing that they couldn't get Parliament to do it. They needed a little bit an extra boost, and maybe those UPR commitments helped the government do its advocacy with Parliament to get that action finally take place. Those are theories, but we'll be doing more research on this topic. But I think it's interesting to see how in these 3 relatively recent case studies, they're all victories. It's wonderful that all 3 countries abolished the death penalty. But I think we need to dig a little bit more deeply to see how it may connect with the UPR, and that can help us shape our advocacy as well. There's certainly some countries that don't engage much with the UPR and don't necessarily care that they have that they come out not smelling like roses in the UPR mechanism. Like China and the death penalty, I don't think, they certainly receive a lot of criticism and a lot of recommendations to abolish the death penalty. They don't seem to acknowledge that pressure. Iran would be the same way. But there are some countries that are poised in a way that they care about their reputation, they care about the international community and the scrutiny that they get during the UPR, and they want to come out with a win. They want to come out with getting praise by their colleagues, by their peer countries, and the UPR is one way for that to happen. So those are 3 case studies. And up next, so one of our colleagues, as I think Jennifer and Elizabeth mentioned, was from Ghana. And Ghana's UPR, the Interactive Dialogue, is in January of next year. And Ghana will be a really interesting country to watch because so many other countries in West Africa have abolished the death penalty. And Ghana is kind of feeling left behind, according to our partner Christoph, who is with us in Geneva. It's like Ghana had always seen itself as a leader in West Africa, and now you have Togo has abolished the death penalty. Burkina Faso has abolished the death penalty. Now you have Sierra Leone has abolished the death penalty. So the neighbors, and Liberia has already introduced a bill to abolish the death penalty with the president's support. And so maybe Ghana is feeling the heat regionally that maybe it needs to clean up its act and abolish the death penalty. The time may be right there. We don't have the national report yet, and the interactive dialogue is coming. So that will be an interesting one to watch. Zambia also coming up, and maybe again some regional pressures to get them to abolish the death penalty as well. So those are a couple countries coming up for UPRs that we want to keep a close eye on to see, is the UPR appearing to have an influence on, at least on maybe on the timing or maybe getting some momentum going toward abolition of the death penalty. So it's exciting to take a look at this and to see, whether they seem to be getting some results. And we will always do advocacy to abolish the death penalty, even for countries that are sort of stalwarts in defending their use of the death penalty, like Singapore and Iran, because we want to make sure that during those 3 hours at the UN, the death penalty gets raised a lot. That sends them the message that they're not going to get away with it. They will still face criticism even if they refuse to abolish. We will always be there doing our advocacy, and our ally governments will always be encouraging them or urging them to abolish the death penalty. So there's always attention on the issue. So even if they don't abolish in the near term, they still know it's a really important issue that the world community cares about and that they need to do a better job of respecting human rights. So our advocacy is important regardless of whether there is change, but it's really interesting to take a look at when there is change, are there connections between the types of advocacy we do and what ultimately happens. So that's our theory and our initial analysis, and we wanted to talk a little bit about how you could get involved. The Advocates for Human Rights is a volunteer-based organization, and so our volunteers, including our pro bono volunteers, are involved in all stages of this process, particularly writing stakeholder reports, so working with our partner organizations in Sierra Leone, for example, to pull together all of that information, to pull together priority recommendations, and to really strategize with our partner organizations. Like if a country is on the verge of abolishing the death penalty, we don't want to bunt in our reports and our priority recommendations. We don't want to recommend that they eliminate the death penalty for drug-related offenses. We want to recommend that they eliminate the death penalty. We want to push them to go for the whole goal. In other countries like Iran, we may work with our partner organizations that focus on death penalty issues in Iran, and they say, okay, our biggest priority here is drug-related offenses and the death penalty for drug-related offenses. So let's have smaller recommendations. Thank you. Let's have some more incremental recommendations that the government of Iran might accept. And our partner organizations really have that sense of what's best, what would be most effective on the ground. So our pro bono partners work with our partner organizations to really craft the targeted recommendations and to gather the evidence, the information that would justify those recommendations, so that when we synthesize those into those one-pagers, we're able to go to the delegates and say, okay, here's why this is a priority recommendation. Here's why this would help advance things on the ground. This is the recommendation, and here's the reasoning behind it. So we're able to take that information that our pro bono partners get working with our partners in country and use that in our advocacy. We also have some pro bono partners that work with us on the further advocacy. We have taken pro bono partners to Geneva with us to help set up those meetings and to work with our partners in getting meetings set up and in talking to delegates and setting up those meetings. So our partners are involved in all stages of the game, and also in that process of working with the partners to do the reporting, building our partners' capacity, because our partners tell us that we would love to do that. We just don't have the time. We're so busy, representing people on death row. We're so busy doing prison visits and all of that. We need your help, and that's how our pro bono partners can really help us all be that megaphone for these people who are overworked, tirelessly advocating for abolition of the death penalty. They don't have all the resources yet to be able to do it all on their own, and we can help them do it. I wanted to leave time for questions as well, and so I think I'll stop sharing my screen here and see if there are any questions, either people who are joining us online or people in the room. Teresa.
How might pressure from the treaty bodies come into play as well? So even if Chad and Sierra Leone and Papua New Guinea, they hadn't ratified the second optional protocol to ICCPR, will the Human Rights Committee still raise death penalty issues when they come for review? I'm assuming they've all ratified ICCPR itself. Mm-hmm. Will the Human Rights Committee also put pressure on the governments during the
Sure.
treaty body review.
Yeah, and I think that would be another piece of this, examination is like to what extent are treaty body reviews influential as well? Because we didn't go into detail about this for lack of time, but countries that have ratified a human rights treaty go through this periodic reporting process as well, where the experts from the treaty body, they have a constructive dialogue and they make recommendations. And so there is typically the Human Rights Committee, the Committee Against Torture, but even the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women will make recommendations on the death penalty, and the Committee on the Rights of the Child will make recommendations on the death penalty. And so those treaty bodies are also a way to pressure the government to change. One thing we don't have in the treaty bodies that we have in the UPR is the official response from the government. Because in the treaty bodies, it's implied that, of course, if it's recommended by the experts, you're going to do it. But a lot of governments are like, you never asked us formally to say whether we're going to do it, and so, we'll just see you next time when we come in for our review, and we'll continue. So the UPR forces governments to get on the record. And so that's why we have a little bit more information from the UPR than we do in the treaty bodies. We can look at sort of the transcripts of the proceedings to see what they say during the reviews, and we can look at the recommendations, but there's no sort of action point where we get a formal response from the government, from the treaty body review. So it's a little bit different. And another way, which is we do the advocacy with the treaty bodies as well. One thing we can do in some cases is if there's a really good recommendation from a treaty body, we'll make that a priority recommendation in the UPR. Because what that does is forces their hand to say, oh, we didn't have to respond to it, but now we do because it's in the UPR. And that can be a really effective way to get them on record about, are you going to do this, what the experts recommended, or not? Other questions? Yes.
I wonder if you can talk a little about the intersection between women and death penalty and our work on that.
Sure.
It was like something very interesting.
Sure. Last year's theme was women and the death penalty for World Day Against the Death Penalty. So it's a topic that is front of mind. And the Advocacy is starting a new project. It's a 3-year project about women and the death penalty. And it's an under-examined topic. People will think, well, there aren't very many women on death row, so, shouldn't you be spending your time focusing on other things? But in fact, most of the women who are sentenced to death worldwide, if you look at their specific cases, there are gender dimensions to their convictions. The primary crime for which women are sentenced to death is murder. The second is drug-related offenses. And in many cases, women are sentenced to death for murder in cases of murder of someone in their household. So it might be an intimate partner, and in some cases, countries have a mandatory death penalty. So if the woman experienced intimate partner violence and she killed her abuser, not when he was attacking her, but after a course of 10 years of abuse, most courts will not take that into consideration as a mitigating factor, especially if the country has a mandatory death penalty for murder. So there's some really interesting gender dimensions there. And with respect to the drug-related offenses, in many cases, women are the mules who are transporting drugs for other people. And in some countries like Singapore, you can escape the death penalty by providing substantial assistance to the prosecutor. But in many cases, the mules don't have enough information to be of use to the prosecutor. They may tell the prosecutor everything that they know, but they just don't know enough to be able to escape the death penalty. While as somebody who's higher up in the drug trade, they'll be able to escape because they know enough that they can, rat out other people and get their certificate of assistance. So there's some really interesting gender dimensions to the death penalty that we'll be looking at over the next few years with the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty and some other partner organizations. Yes?
How many countries around the world still retain the death penalty?
I believe 55 is the count, currently executing people. So carrying out executions, there's sort of a rough definition of what does it mean to have a de facto moratorium on executions. So I think roughly they say if a country hasn't carried out any executions in the last 10 years, they're considered to be have a de facto moratorium or be de facto abolitionists. Like Papua New Guinea would have fallen into that category because they hadn't executed for some time. But roughly 55 countries still actively execute or have in the last 10 years, I think is roughly what the statistics are.
What happens with your advocacy when a government changes, or if the UPR happens during campaigns? Also, I mean, there are some countries that announce campaigns for 6 weeks and then there's elections.
Yep. So excellent point there. You know, you think, well, we had this UPR for the United States. When did the UPR of the United States happen? It was delayed because of the pandemic. Ultimately, it happened in November 2020. That might ring a bell for those of you based in the United States. So it happened a week after the election. And so we had a certain administration in power then that went to Geneva. And by the time the report was adopted and all of that was wrapping up, it was a new administration. So it can, you know, things can be in flux when administrations change. Their commitments to human rights may change as well. That's not supposed to allow them to back out of things that they've accepted to do. It's supposed to be a commitment, but, you know, it's a political body and politics changes who's in power as well. And so that can be, you know, fortunately or unfortunately, that can change the dynamics there. But I think it's still embarrassing for a country to make a public commitment and then come back in 5 years and say, oh, just kidding. So I think most countries still feel some obligation to do something with the recommendations they have accepted, even if it was a previous administration that they don't necessarily agree with. Not always the case, but I think it's part of that sort of diplomatic nature of the UN. You don't want countries to think that your commitment to human rights is so flexible that depending on who's elected to power, you'll, you know, throw things out or wrap things back in.
Back to the women in the death penalty, how many women are on death row in the U.S.?
I don't know the exact figures. There's a great resource to look to would be the Cornell Center on the Death Penalty Worldwide. They have a really good network throughout the United States about the number of women on death row. Okay. I think overall worldwide, it's probably 1 to 2% of the overall overall death row population. I wanted to repeat the CLE code for anyone who may have missed it. So let me find that again. It's 473328. And if you have any problems getting that, you can email us and we'll get that to you again. I apologize, we went 4 minutes over time, but thank you all for those of you who joined us online. I hope you were able to hear everything, and thank you all for those of you who are here in person. We have a reception to follow, so we will make our way to the reception to have some food and drink there. Thank you all. We really appreciate your attention. And again, please join us in noting World Day Against the Death Penalty with the hashtag #NoDeathPenalty, and take a look at it on social media to see all the different events that are going on worldwide. Thanks so much.